Okay.
What? Now.
All right, so before I begin, I just want to say I want to keep this pretty informal, so feel free to jump in if you have comments, questions, if you disagree with me, which hopefully you will, So, okay, so I'm the first presentation, and I kind of like being the first because we're just getting introduced to the class, so I have a chance to kind of say my own opinions, my own viewpoints on why we study film, why we're studying philosophy of film. And so we've all done the reading, so I kind of want to present my own views, my own reactions to the reading. I agree with a lot of it, disagree with some of it. I understand, hopefully, most of it, and I'm sure I misunderstood some of it. But, I mean, it definitely brought up a lot of questions in my mind, and hopefully my talk will bring up some more questions that we'll go over through the rest of the term, because I can't possibly answer all the questions that came into my head.
Let me interrupt briefly. If you have any ideas about the movie we watched last time,
Yeah.
Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah, I have some ideas on that, and
You
also
can feel free to bring that in.
Okay. So one of the major questions that I have that's kind of a recurring theme in my life is why study film? Because I've been studying film all through MIT, and obviously all of us have chosen to study film too. And I didn't really know why, It's not like my parents made me or I need to do it to graduate or something, It's just something that I choose to do. And it's a very personal question for all of us, and we probably each have our own answers. And I'm going to talk about why I choose to study film, because I've thought about it a lot. And to answer that, I need to tell you a little bit about my personal life, and I'll get to that. But first, some definitions, like realism and formalism were mentioned in the text. And at MIT, I've taken, I don't know, like 3 or 4 film classes now, and in each of those classes, we generally use a combination of those 2 techniques. And honestly, I think they're pretty hard to define. They seem to be the opposite ends of a spectrum in which you can analyze film. And so there's 2 different ways you can look at each aspect of film. So that means, for example, story, editing, costumes, everything. There's 2 different ways you can look at it. So it's hard to define since they overlap so much. But still, I try to define them, because I want to have a clear picture of what exactly they mean. So in realism, it seems like what that means is the film is capturing an aspect of real life, and that's what makes it powerful. Basically, I'm sure you've all heard that art imitates life. So something about film is reflecting the actual world. And maybe even more than reflecting, it's representing the world, or being the world. Now let's talk about formalism. To me, that means that you're using the power of film, you're using technology to extend real life. So for example, with editing, of course a realist would have something different to say about this, but for editing, you're able to change temporality. You can rearrange time, you can rearrange space, and that's part of the power of film, in which you can change reality and give people something more. Okay, so as I said, we analyzed film in my previous classes using a combination of the 2 things, because you want to see how it relates to the real world, but you also want to see what directors can do to harness the power of the medium. So which way is the best? I really don't know, but I think a combination of the 2 is useful, because at least then you can see you can try to get the advantages of both approaches. Okay, so I want to say a quote from a movie, actually. There's a quote from The Player, which was, I think it came out in the 80s, directed by Altman. And the quote I want to say is, "Movies are art now more than ever." And that's a quote by the main character. And so to me, that's one of the central reasons why we study film, because we think that it's art. And that's great, except how do you define art? Because that's really hard to define too. And in fact, it's an ongoing battle with modern art. A lot of people go to an art museum and see a piece of modern art and they say, "Oh, that's not art." Well, why? It's really hard to define. So let me tell you a little bit about my own personal background. I started playing piano and violin when I was 4 years old, and all the way up to MIT when I became too busy with problem sets to really play much anymore. But so to me, music was my first art. My first love of art came from music. Now, if you look at music, you can't really use realism and formalism to analyze music, because, well,
Go ahead.
You want to say something?
Well, you can talk about leaving aside representational music, which is obviously going to be patterned upon some reality, right?
Yeah.
A tone poem by Richard Strauss wants you to hear or imagine sonically what the sheep are in Don Quixote, or what the adventures are of Don Juan. That's the nature of programmatic tone poems of that sort. Now that would be a realistic effect. But over and above that, almost everybody recognizes that music is important for what it expresses. Stravinsky said somewhere, music doesn't express anything. It expresses itself, which is a way of denying that it expresses anything in the composer or in the world, feelings or a theory of the world, an attitude toward the world. It's not expressive at all. What's amusing, however, is that Stravinsky's music is often very, very expressive. And he went through Romantic period and then Classical period. And in the Classical period, there's a great emphasis on technique, but it nevertheless remains expressive. The formalist view would emphasize music as a series of techniques, as requiring a knowledge of the scales, of different ways of manipulating the notes, of different forms, musical forms. And that's what's usually taught in music classes, the introductory ones, because they're afraid the students are going to have daydreams about some romantic moment, or something in Schubert which is very sad, or very, something like that, and never hear the music. So that there too you get the same problem about the formalistic element and the realistic one, and the difficulty for the theorist or the philosopher is to make sense out of what these different alternatives might be. And so it's not entirely different from film. Okay. But I didn't mean to interrupt you that long.
Oh, no, that's okay. So when I was growing up, though, of course, I didn't approach music with such a philosophy. I was just trying to enjoy it and try to see how it's an art form. And one of the things that I noticed is just that music is highly capable of producing emotion in someone, and that's something strange. Why should these noises produce an emotional response in a human being? And that's probably never going to be explained, but that's one of the reasons to me that it makes it art. It is able to evolve this emotion. And so I think my personal definition of art, like what is art to me, well, I would say that it's something that can either provoke a cognitive or an affective response. So what does that mean? It either makes me think or it makes me have an emotional response to it, of which music can do both. And so to me, art is all about the perception. I don't really. Actually, let me save that for a little bit later. But so, what is it about perception? Why would we enjoy something that makes us think, something that makes us feel emotions? Well, I think that's just one of the basic aspects of humanity that we want to learn, we want to experience. So art makes us learn and it makes us experience, and that satisfies one of our basic desires.
Let me interrupt you again. One of the burdens, the main burden of the book, which you'll realize when you finish it, is to say that our way of formulating the problem between the realistic and the formalistic is itself deficient, and that's the job of the philosopher, to help us make our ideas clear. And my suggestion is that the two alternatives are not really separate. It's an artificial distinction, the way most philosophical distinctions are. And in reality, the two interpenetrate. And so one has to find a way of explaining and understanding and experiencing the interpenetration, so that it's not just a question of music doing both the formalistic and the non-formalistic one, both making sounds and also expressing emotions, but the two are interwoven. And then how does one make sense out of the concept of the interweaving and what are different ways of doing that. Briefly, in terms of your two instruments, there are pianists and violinists who seem to have a very profound understanding of the music in terms of the feelings, like Yehudi Menuhin would be a good example. On the other hand, in violin, on the other hand, there are those whose technique is absolutely perfect and they don't seem to express very much. They really know how to use the instrument, but they don't use it with any profound insight. Well, for me, as a listener, as observing the situation, it tells me something about them as people. You know, I want to say Yehudi Menuhin, in order to play like that, has not only learned how to use the technique, but he has developed in his personality. And so if one says about his music, it's very spiritual, very soulful, very filled with a kind of natural acceptance of the world and of other people, and that in that sense he's a very beautiful person. I've never met him, but just listening, I've seen him on screen, of course, but listening to the music, I feel like I'm in touch with that aspect of his being. Well, that's because of the way in which he integrates the formal and the technical, the formal and the realistic, and that others do it in a different way, and that tells me something about them. In either event, the art is a function of the humanity, the total humanity of the practitioner. And the difficulty is that you can teach people scales and exercises. You can't teach them how to be human. They've got somehow to be lucky enough to grow up in a world in which it comes out of them. Maybe they had to suffer, or maybe they had to have a loving parent, especially a loving woman. You know, that I don't mean a loving mother. I haven't done the sociology, but I'll bet one finds that a great many of the really outstanding musicians learn music from their mothers, particularly if they were men. I don't know about the girls, but being a little boy sitting at your mother's lap while she's playing the piano and teaching you affects them as human beings, and also accelerates their ability to become proficient technicians in their art form. So there are all sorts of causes about the expressiveness, but the two are not going to be separable ultimately. And that's what I tried to argue. That was my inspiration when I tried to argue the thesis in Reality Transformed. You noticed in the first chapter I set up the positions in terms of theorists who've maintained that they were realists or formalists, and I attacked both of them with the idea that what they're saying isn't wrong, but having limited themselves, they're ignoring something else. And then in the last chapter, I suggest the integration and how difficult it is to understand. The second book of mine you'll be reading tries to start from that, except starting with exemplars of cinematic greatness, three great filmmakers, none of whom people would have called philosophers because they don't come in with theses like some European in particular filmmakers, but they're great men, and approached properly one can see what the depths of their souls are, and that's all I care about is when I talk about philosophical. I don't care whether they've taken courses called philosophy in some university, or whether they've written the equivalent of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. It's their having a deep awareness and sensitivity to what it is to be a human being, and then without their knowing necessarily what they're doing, introducing that into the expressiveness and the meaningfulness of their work of art, but doing it on the basis of absolute technical mastery, since the two cannot be separated.
Okay, so I want to go back again to that question on why we study film, you know, and so I'll tell you a little bit about my own personal view. I'm an engineer. I'm at MIT to do electrical engineering, and what does that involve? That involves solving a lot of problems, and in general, they're pretty easy, you know, like one of the hardest problems would probably take like, you know, like a couple days to solve before you figure it out, and then you go on and build something as an engineer. And the attraction of art and philosophy is that the problem can never really be solved as far as we know. You know, you can keep on working on it forever. You can keep on trying to figure out why film is so powerful, and you'll come up with a lot of reasons, but you won't ever know for sure. And as problem solvers, you know, that's I mean, we chose to
challenge.
Exactly. You know, we live on the challenge, and that, for me, that's why I enjoy the challenge, as opposed to say studying economics or something where the problems are generally solved and you just learn how to solve problems that have been solved.
Or mathematics.
Yeah.
Which is an art form based on the possibility of a solution and then the achievement of it.
Yeah.
Am I wrong? Are there any mathematicians here? You came in late. I talked a little about life not being like a mathematical problem with you, did I? Or was that my other class? Why it is that I'm a humanist and pluralist. But in the context of that, what I believe and what I must have said to the other class this term was that mathematics is a great art form. It's an abstract art form, and therefore possibly the greatest of any pure art form. It's pure art. I'm not talking about useful mathematics. I'm talking about mathematics that is not useful. Pure mathematics is pure art because it is purely abstract. And that's because it can be solved, and therefore it can be solved. Life is not like that, and therefore, apart from the art of mathematics, the usual arts like film and music and literature are challenging and intriguing, particularly to MIT students, because you can recognize the problem, and it's not clear that there is a solution to it, which doesn't mean you shouldn't work at it.
How much time do we have to? I don't want to have to.
We can go on for an hour this way. This is very profitable,
okay.
I think.
Okay.
No? Do any of you feel differently? Then
I just meant because of the movie that we.
Do you want to what?
Because we have to watch the movie.
No, well, we have an hour before.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. So I want to talk a little bit about the uniqueness and power of film as opposed to other media. So what is different about film? You know, first of all, it can display any image. It's not limited. Say an artist, a paint artist is limited by the colors he can use or the brush. I don't know much about painting, but the technique that he has, he can't just put anything up there. Of course, there's sound in film, which can be very powerful. There's editing, special effects, and the experience of watching film is very different, and that's unique to film. And there's definitely advantages and disadvantages. I'll mention a few. And finally, one of the great powers of film to me is that it's just socially pervasive and acceptable. You know, like it's a great tool as an artist, a director as an artist, in that he can release a film and instantly, worldwide, it's accessible to everyone. And I mean, that's really every artist's dream. You know, if you're an artist right now and you want to get your work out, film is probably the best medium in which to do it.
But there's another dream, and that is once you've achieved that kind of success, you care about the audience. You want to make sure that they know how to look at film.
Exactly.
And that's what this kind of course addresses itself to.
Okay, so I want to also compare film to photography because they're similar in some ways and very different in other ways. So I think the chief difference between film and between movies and photography is the way they're experienced. Now, in a photograph, the image is self-sufficient, and the way it's experienced is you look at it and your eye may be drawn around the film. I'm sure you've heard, the photograph, sorry. And I'm sure you've heard about artwork, paintings which draw your gaze to a piece of the artwork. And that's commonly analyzed. Something similar is done with photography. In film, it can still be done, but not to the same extent because you're experiencing a constant stream of pictures instead of one self-sufficient picture. And also the experience in which you have at a movie theater is completely different than looking at a photograph. So how do we look at movies? In general, you go to a movie theater, you sit down, and for 2 hours or however long, you watch the film on the screen. what about photography? You go to an art gallery, or maybe it's in a magazine at home, and so that experience is completely different. And I want to bring up an example of a horror movie. Now, I was actually talking about this with my roommates yesterday, which is why I bring this up. But so what is it about a horror movie that is so appealing to people? Because so my roommates said that, well, it's because it makes you feel scared, and to me that kind of makes sense. But why would you want to feel scared? You know, that you could just go outside and walk alone at night. You know, then you feel scared, but that's not enjoyable. So what is it about a scary movie that's enjoyable? Well, I think it's because you know you're in the theater, you know you're safe, but you can still sympathize with the characters that you're seeing. And so I just bring up this example because it's one of the, it's something that the director has to keep in mind for the mental state of his audience. They know they're safe. They know they're probably in a theater or at home watching it on TV. And this is part of the experience that they get as they're watching the film. And that's part of the art form. That's part of the medium.
Okay. We can discuss this further when you read my chapter on Hitchcock, who talks a great deal about this. The principle that he develops is fear and fear not. Go ahead.
Okay, and one thing that is really, really important about film to me is that it's influenced by all other films that I've seen. It's influenced by everything that I've seen, you know, because my experience watching a movie is going to be different than, okay, let's take the example of Beauty and the Beast. Our experience last week watching Beauty and the Beast, I'm sure, was vastly different than audiences watching it when it first came out. And does that mean we saw less of an artwork? No, I don't think so. Does it really matter to us? Is the point of our watching that film to try to recreate the experience of the original audiences at the time when it came out? No, I don't think so either. I think to us it's a whole different piece of art than to the people back then, or even say me versus someone else in this room. We have a completely different way of thinking about the movie. It drew out different emotions in us, but I think that's okay, and that's part of the power of art, is that it can draw out different emotions, different thinking from every single person, from every single time, with different experiences that watches the movie.
Well, let me interrupt that. That movie was made, what, 60 years ago almost, and in a world that you can't possibly appreciate because even your parents probably weren't born then. And that's the difference. And people then, for the people that, who saw it, they were living in that world, and you aren't anymore. At the same time, and also, so that's a big difference. Another difference is the version you saw last week has been digitalized, cleaned up, restored, looks better than it ever did, including the first time it was shown. It was probably much more grainy then. And here you saw it as a beautiful, perfect entity in itself, true to its spirit, but not identical to the first seeing. So that in that sense, too, it's very different. But I think what's most important is the fact that you're different, that happens inevitably in the passage of time. Life, in a sense, never repeats itself. You know, there is a saying about history repeating itself, but history doesn't repeat itself because every moment is a function of what happened before, and that affects the novelty of that moment, which then becomes the past for the next moment. That life is dynamic, it's developing, and consequently, in a sense, we can't live the past anymore. But we don't have to, because as we change, we're capable of aesthetic aptitudes that didn't exist before. So that it's a very complicated thing, the presence of time in relation to particularly a temporal phenomenon like the movies. It's also true of non-temporal arts like poetry. But why don't you go on?
Okay, adding on to that, I strongly believe that recording doesn't reproduce reality, and a large part of that is based on the experience that you have as you're watching whatever has been recorded. So, for example, this class is being recorded, and someone somewhere is probably going to watch this tape eventually, and their experience is going to be very different than the experience of everyone in this class. And so it's not like by watching the tape, they're suddenly sitting in an empty seat in this room, as realistic as the tape may be. And that's something to keep in mind also. And that applies to photography as well. That definitely applies to film. So finally, I just want to talk a little bit about Beauty and the Beast and also Citizen Kane. So Beauty and the Beast, it's clear that it's not supposed to reflect reality, since there's a beast. You know, it's fictional characters. It's a
beast who talks.
Yeah, fictional fairy tale story. You know, there's the girl that can transport herself with the power of the glove, and so it's not a realistic story, but it's still powerful. At least I found it very powerful. And why? Because it doesn't really reflect real life. Well, to me, it does reflect real human themes. Most notably, the love conquers all theme. The Beast and Belle are in love, and this you see in real life, and you also see in the movie. And in the movie, love wins in the end. And so,
in love of some sort, that's something we can discuss. Go ahead.
And so this kind of movie seems to trigger just the basic humanistic concerns, you know. And I'll just name a couple things that the movie has in it. Physical beauty, forbidden love. These are common themes that people think about and can easily see reflected in real life.
No, you're not forbidden to love a monster. It's just it's not ordinary. It usually doesn't happen.
It's socially unacceptable in the movie, which is a common theme in real life too. Okay, so Citizen Kane.
Let's discuss this first. Sure. Does anybody want to say anything about Beauty and the Beast? Let me make a couple of remarks. Cocteau, who directed it, who wrote it, who was this great genius, really, told the crew, particularly the cinematographer Alacant, who does a wonderful job, and Chrétien Bérard, who is the set designer, he said, what I want to do is to make a documentary of another world, of a magical world. I don't want it to be have frills and look like magic. I want it to be another world, which is different from ours because it is magic. Now, he couldn't have had in mind Beauty and Beast that the Disney studio made about 15 years ago, which most of you may have seen. That's not a documentary of anything. That is touching your sense of fancy and the fantasy, and that's not what, I read a lot about that in my chapter, but I don't want to get into it right now. But I want to mention that as an alternative to what Cocteau tried for, and I think succeeded. He gets us into the mood that, of course, this is what a beast would look like and would talk like if he were able to talk. You know, you're involved in that other reality, and the whole fantasy of it, the magic castle, and the articles like the glove and the mirror that have magical properties, but they're real articles, they're real things in the world, and you get a feeling for the real world. Why did Cocteau do this? That itself is a big story, and briefly, it's because he was talking about what he calls the poetry of film. His life output is mainly as a poet. He made movies starting with The Blood of the Poet, which is what's called a surrealist movie, but it isn't really, but I'll give you an idea. In 1930, when he was already over 40, I think, and then he didn't make another movie for 15 years, and that second movie was Beauty and the Beast. In the meantime, he was turning out volume after volume of poetry, stage plays, novels, stories, everything, but always as a poet. And his attraction to film was that he saw that there's an aspect of film that is or can be poetic. But he distinguishes between poetry itself and the poetic. He says the poetic is what people try to emulate when they're being superficial. They're trying to act poetically, you know. You get that mood that is being expressed, and that's not what real life poetry is like. That's not what poetry is really like. In real life, poetry comes out of the things of everyday life, out of common existence, and it comes out in unpredictable ways. If you look for it, you won't find it because it hides. But if you are perceptive and aware of the difference, it'll suddenly appear in unexpected places. And for him, the attraction of film is that film lends itself to that bringing forth of poetry. I'll come back to this more when we talk about Wells and Renoir, both of whom speak of poetic effects, but they don't analyze it and haven't thought it through as well as Cocteau did. In the film, everything is as if it were real. The farmhouse at the beginning, the ordinary life, that we accept, oh yeah, that's real, a real farmhouse, and it was a real farmhouse. And then the castle, the enchanted castle, looks like a real thing, except that unreal things happen in it, but they happen in a way that make it as if in another reality there could be arms coming out of the walls that hold candles, or that pour the wine for you, or that are faces embedded in the mantelpiece that keep moving around. You remember all that? All of that is real, but in an unreal use and unreal context, which is just what Cocteau wants. And as a way of enforcing that, he avoided all special effects. Now, we live in a world in which special effects have taken over the film industry and all visual experiences that we have. In his day, when the movie was made in 1945, they existed, though they hadn't gone as far because they didn't have the computers at that time. And he doesn't want it. There's only one special effect in the movie. Does anybody spot it?
When she disappears.
There's the moment that Belle has come back to the farm and dressed gorgeously with her magnificent, what is it, collar or bracelet, that's a necklace, that's right. And her sister obviously envies it, and she takes it off to hand it to her sister. The minute it leaves her hands, it turns into a cluster of rope that falls to the ground. That's a special effect. It's the only one. And we're used to that, so we don't even notice it. So the Cocteau's idea, and what's interesting in the movie, is that it is like a documentary of another world. And that poses questions about the meaningfulness, which I mustn't start because, I've written 9,000 words already, and I'm only half finished. Go ahead.
Okay, so I just want to say, to wrap up, a few words on Citizen Kane.
Okay, let's go to Citizen Kane, unless somebody wants to say something about it. Did you all get something out of that movie? I thought it would get increasingly more meaningful to you, especially after you've had a chance to read the discussion about formalism and realism, because it uses both. It has formal tricks like the beast carrying Beauty into her room. Did you notice she's attired the way she was on the farm until she goes through the door, and then she ends up gorgeously dressed. Now that's a formal technique. It's very inventive. Citizen Kane is considered the greatest movie ever made by many people because it has so many of those inventive techniques, and yet they work on another level as well in Citizen Kane and also in Beauty and the Beast. Anything else? Anything any of you want to say about that? Okay, let's go to Citizen Kane.
Okay, I don't want to give away too much about the movie because.
How many have not seen it? I think about half. I think.
but I've studied it in several other classes, and one thing that's often brought up is just the history of the film. Orson Welles, who's the director, was a radio star at the time, but had, I think, no experience at all in movies, and this was his first film.
Yes, that's true. Go on.
And it was a huge success, and at the time, it was just groundbreaking for things that he did in editing, in special effects especially, and also the camera work. So those are the main things that we studied. One thing that you hear time and time again is deep focus, which is possible. I think this was the first film that really used it.
People say that, and it's not true.
Okay.
But it's not your fault. It's a common mistake. When you see the movie by Renoir called Rules of the Game, which is also treated as one of the 2 or 3 greatest movies ever made, and that you'll be seeing it in this course, you will see examples of deep focus. And the movie was made in 1939, before Orson Welles. But Orson Welles developed it further, and he gets the credit, but he wasn't the first one. Go ahead.
Okay, so I mean, this historical background is nice, but it doesn't really affect our viewing experience of the movie, and it's still a very powerful movie. Otherwise, why would people say it's the greatest movie of all time? And so, as I was watching the movie, I wasn't really impressed by these special effects at all, because I've seen them now. I've seen them hundreds of times already.
Give an example.
Okay, so there's one scene where the camera will scroll up. Okay, so they'll be on a stage. The camera will scroll up, and then suddenly it'll be another scene. It'll show a person clapping, and so at the time that was a tough special effect to do without computers, without ways of editing. Now it's you see it all the time. A camera will pan, and then suddenly you'll be in a different scene, and that's really easy to do nowadays.
What you're referring to, perhaps, is when Cain gives a political speech. And so you see him on the stage with this is one of the images that's often copied. Even on the cover of that's right, the dust jacket of my book, in the wreath, where there are excerpts from films by Hitchcock and Renoir as well as Wells, there's one vignette that shows Wells with his arms stretched out, pointing to his own photograph. That happens in this scene. It's part of his political speech. It's done in a big audience, a big theater, and you occasionally get quick shots of people in the audience. Well, there were no people in the audience. That was done with photographs. It saved a lot of money, and there was no need for there to be real people, so they did it that way. In a movie like Titanic, where they have hordes of people in all sorts of scenes, a lot of them are not real, but rather special effects. With the computer, you can do more of that. I myself think that the computerized things, for instance, in the movie, in Titanic, but also the one called Pearl Harbor, where they do that a lot at the end, for instance, that it's so obvious that for me, it detracted from the value of the movie. In the case of Wells, I don't think I would ever have noticed this if I hadn't read about it. I'm telling it to you now so you can see for yourself. That's an example of a special effect, and Wells was very artful in doing that.
Right, I agree with that. I mean,
without a computer.
All of the effects I really wouldn't have known if I hadn't listened to the director's commentary, where he talks about how he had to saw a table in half so that he could open it as he moved the camera through. Things like that are just, nowadays they probably would have some fancier way of doing it, but it's not something that is really impressive to the modern audience. Yet, Citizen Kane is still a very powerful film, and I don't really know exactly why, but to me, there's some questions and there's some mysteries in the movie that aren't really answered, and to me, that just keeps me thinking about it long after I leave the theater or leave the room where I've been watching it. I just keep reflecting on the movie, and to me, that's the real power of Citizen Kane.
Was the example about the sawing of the table out of Citizen Kane?
Yeah, when he's in when Kane's in the window, off playing in the snow in the distance as a boy, and his parents are talking, and the camera's behind the table. You'll notice it, and then the camera moves forward, and they had to chop the table in half to get the
Because
camera.
because Wells was a professional magician, and that shows up in various ways. You know, he sawed ladies in half. Go ahead.
Okay, so I think I think I hit all the main points that I wanted
Well, that's
to.
splendid. I think that's a very good presentation, and we have time. For anybody else to say something?
I just wanted to say something about Beauty and the Beast. Like, something that I thought was interesting was the communication that he tried to have with the audience, especially like even just the beginning before the movie started. You know how he's like, well, just take your preconceptions of Beauty and the Beast and just humor me in this film and watch it in a different way. And I thought that was very interesting that he set up the movie like that and actually came out and said that, and then I don't know.
Well, he says that in order to awaken your imagination, the way he thinks it would be for children. In other words, be a child. But it's not a movie for children. I don't think children would get much out of it. But that's the mode of expression. Notice that the credits are put on in a schoolroom. And he is like the teacher who writes it on the blackboard. But then the actors, who are dressed not in their costumes but as real people, they come up and they erase it. So there is that play, which is very clever, I think.
Yeah. So it's also like the reality of, like, trying to show the reality of magic, like trying to put yourself in that. I thought that was something, a theme through the whole movie, you know.
Why don't we go, because otherwise it'll run after 5. I may myself be in a little late. Who was it who put the movie in last time?
It's not here today.
Was it you?
It's not here, but it's not here today.
Pardon?
It's not here today. The person who put it in.
Oh, I say it again?
The person who put it in the last time, he's not here today.
Oh, he's not here today.
Yeah.
Can any of you manage this? Or you really know, because there's some trouble with the DVD there.
I can try.
Okay, put it in, and if I'm not back, start it anyhow. But I'll try very hard to get back in time. In the meantime, could you make out a card?
Or one.